Blood on the pine needles told the story before Charles Benton even dismounted his horse. The escaped slave had fought here, clawed at the earth, left pieces of torn cloth on thorns that caught moonlight like surrender flags. This was 1822, when human hunting was legal commerce across the Carolinas. And Charles Benton had made himself the most feared name whispered in slave quarters from Charleston to Charlotte. The trail led deeper into the Pee swamplands, where cypress roots twisted like arthritic fingers and Spanish moss hung heavy as funeral shrouds. The air tasted of decay and desperation, while water lapped against rotted logs with the patience of something that had swallowed secrets before. Benton pressed his boot into the soft earth beside a creek, reading the story written in mud and broken branches. The runaway was injured, favoring his left leg, moving slower now. Good. Fear made them predictable. Charles Benton wasn't born to this work. The son of a failed tobacco farmer from the North Carolina Piedmont, he discovered his talent by accident in 1818 when a neighbor's field hand disappeared during harvest season. Benton tracked the man for 3 days through dense forest, following bent grass and disturbed anthills with the instinct of something predatory. When he dragged the enslaved man back in chains, the neighbor paid him $20, more money than Benton had seen in months. Word spread through the network of plantation owners who communicated across state lines like a spider web of commerce and control. A man who could track runaways, who understood their desperation enough to anticipate their moves, who possessed the stomach for what came after capture. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 had made slave catching a federal business, but it took particular men to excel at it. From the Charleston Mercury, September 5, 1821, Mr. Charles Benton of Mecklenburg County advertises his services in the recapture of absconded Negroes. No distance too great, no terrain too difficult. Satisfaction guaranteed, or no payment required. Benton's reputation grew with each successful hunt. He learned to think like prey, to understand the Underground Railroad's hidden routes, to recognize the subtle signs enslaved people used to communicate escape plans. He studied their psychology with the dedication of a scholar, noting how mothers ran differently than young men, how field hands chose different hiding spots than house slaves, how desperation changed people's decision-making in predictable patterns. The swamp sound shifted around him now. Nightbirds fell silent. Something large moved through water ahead. Benton's hand found his pistol, though he preferred the psychological impact of chains. The rattle of iron links had a way of breaking spirits before flesh. He developed methods that other bounty hunters copied across the South. Never pursue immediately after an escape. Let them run for 2 days, exhaust themselves, make mistakes, then follow methodically, using their panic against them. Set up camps at creek crossings where they'd need water. Use dogs selectively when terrain favored it. Most importantly, understand that every captured runaway was a message to hundreds of others still in bondage. The mud told him the story continued northeast, toward the old Cherokee trading paths that some runaways thought would lead them to freedom. They never did. Those paths led to Charles Benton. What drives a man to make his living from human misery? Is it the money, the thrill of the hunt, or something darker that feeds on others' desperation? Tonight's quarry had made one fatal mistake that would seal his fate, and Charles Benton knew exactly what it was. Before we follow this hunt to its brutal conclusion, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear gets much darker. The forest ahead held the sound of running water, and something else. Something that would turn this routine capture into the defining moment of Benton's blood-soaked career. The runaway had doubled back through his own tracks, a desperate gambit that might have fooled an amateur. Charles Benton smiled in the darkness, recognizing the technique he'd seen dozens of times before. This pattern revealed everything about how the human mind breaks under extreme pressure. and Benton had spent 4 years studying that breakdown with scientific precision. The enslaved man's name was Samuel, according to the reward poster tucked in Benton's saddlebag. 23 years old, field hand from the Morrison Plantation outside Camden. 5 foot 8 inches, distinctive scar across his left palm from a cotton gin accident. Worth $800 to his owner, $50 to Benton upon delivery. Dead or alive, though alive commanded a premium. Benton had developed a taxonomy of runaways during his career. The desperates ran immediately after punishment, driven by pain rather than planning. They rarely lasted 3 days. The dreamers believed stories about northern cities where black people lived free, following rumors like gospel. They made it furthest, but fell hardest when reality crushed hope. The calculators planned for months, stockpiling food and studying routes. These were the most dangerous because they understood the stakes. Samuel was a dreamer. The evidence lay scattered along his trail like breadcrumbs. He'd taken the main road initially, believing speed mattered more than stealth. He'd stopped at a creek to drink instead of filling containers and moving on. Most tellingly, he'd headed northeast toward Virginia, following stories about Quaker settlements that welcomed runaways. Those stories killed more escaped slaves than any bounty hunter ever would. The creek crossing showed where Samuel had finally learned fear. Footprints revealed he'd approached the water cautiously, then retreated, then approached again. The psychological moment when hope transforms into terror, when the enormity of the decision crashes down like a falling tree. Benton had witnessed this transformation hundreds of times. It never lost its fascination. From Benton's journal, September 18th, 1822. The Morrison boy shows classic signs of breakdown. Trail indicates he stopped running twice yesterday, sat by water for extended periods. Will be found within 12 hours, likely in a defensible position where panic trumps logic. The business of human hunting required more than tracking skills. Benton had cultivated relationships with ferry operators who reported suspicious crossings, tavern keepers who noticed nervous travelers, even ministers who sometimes harbored runaways out of misguided Christian charity. Information flowed to him like water finding its level. He learned to read the subtle signs that preceded escapes. Field hands who suddenly showed interest in distant counties during casual conversation. House slaves who asked too many questions about travel times to different cities. Women who began hoarding food scraps or mending clothes with unusual care. Plantation owners paid premium rates for this intelligence, viewing Benton as insurance against their human property depreciating through flight. The sound of running water grew louder as Benton followed Samuel's trail deeper into the swamp. Ahead, firelight flickered between the trees. The runaway had made camp, probably thinking darkness would hide him. Amateur mistake. Fire was visible for miles in this terrain, and the smoke carried distinctive odors that trained nostrils could identify. Benton dismounted quietly, checking his equipment with practiced efficiency. Rope for binding, chains for transport, pistol for compliance. He'd refined these tools through experience, understanding that psychological intimidation often prevented the need for physical violence. Fear was more effective than force, cheaper than brutality. But some runaways fought anyway, driven by desperation that transcended rational calculation. Those encounters had taught Benton darker lessons about human nature, about the sounds people make when hope dies, about the precise amount of pain required to break resistance without damaging valuable property. The campfire ahead cast dancing shadows on cypress trunks, while night sounds masked Benton's approach. Samuel sat with his back to a fallen log, staring into flames that would guide his hunter straight to him. The young man's shoulders shook, with exhaustion or fear, or both. Human beings reduced to economics, tracked like animals, valued by the pound like livestock. What separated Charles Benton from the monsters he claimed to hunt was a question that would define the next bloody hour in those South Carolina swamps. Samuel heard the footsteps too late, spinning toward the sound, as Charles Benton emerged from Spanish moss curtains with his pistol drawn but not aimed. The psychological impact of visible restraint often proved more effective than direct threats. This moment would teach both men lessons about cruelty that neither would forget, though only one would survive to remember. The campfire crackled between them like a stage light, illuminating the final act of Samuel's brief taste of freedom. His eyes darted toward the swamp, calculating distances, weighing odds that had already shifted beyond hope. Benton had positioned himself perfectly, cutting off escape routes while maintaining clear sight lines. 4 years of practice had taught him to think 3 moves ahead. "Easy now," Benton said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to obedience. "No need for anyone to get hurt if you come along quiet." Samuel's hand moved toward something behind the log. A stick or stone he'd probably been clutching since making camp. Benton recognized the gesture, the way desperate people convinced themselves they possessed options they'd already lost. The psychology of the cornered revealed itself in predictable patterns. "Your master Morrison sent me to bring you home," Benton continued, stepping closer with measured confidence. "Says he'll overlook this foolishness if you come back willing. Keep running, and he's authorized me to use whatever methods necessary." The lie came easily because it contained enough truth to sound plausible. Morrison had indeed authorized force, though he'd expressed no interest in forgiveness. Plantation owners rarely rewarded escape attempts with mercy, understanding that lenience encouraged others to test boundaries. Samuel's return would serve as public example, his punishment witnessed by every slave on the property. Samuel's breathing quickened as he processed options that didn't exist. 23 years of bondage had taught him to recognize certain tones in white voices, to calibrate resistance based on consequences he'd witnessed others face. But freedom, even temporary freedom, had awakened something that made submission feel impossible. "I ain't going back," Samuel said, his voice breaking on the words. "Rather die out here than live in chains." Benton had heard similar declarations hundreds of times. They always came from runaways who discovered freedom's weight, who realized that escaping bondage meant more than leaving a plantation. It meant navigating a world designed to return them to their owners, where every stranger might be an enemy, where survival required skills slavery had never taught them. "Death's permanent," Benton replied, circling the fire with predatory patience. "Chains ain't. You're young, strong. Survive whatever punishment Morrison dishes out. You'll have chances to see your family again. Die out here, and they'll never know what happened to you." The psychological manipulation was deliberate. Benton had learned to weaponize hope, to use family connections and future possibilities against runaways whose desperation made them vulnerable to any promise of eventual relief. Empty promises, usually, but effective in breaking immediate resistance. Samuel clutched his makeshift weapon tighter, a piece of broken branch that might serve as club if swung with sufficient desperation. The firelight revealed tears cutting tracks through dirt on his face, the collision between dreams and reality playing out in real time. From the Camden Gazette, October 1st, 1822, the efficient recapture of the Morrison property demonstrates the value of professional slave-catching services. Order maintained through swift justice serves the interests of all law-abiding citizens. The attack came without warning. Samuel lunged across the fire, swinging his branch toward Benton's head with the fury of someone who'd already accepted death as preferable to surrender. The bounty hunter sidestepped easily, grabbing Samuel's wrist and twisting until the improvised weapon dropped into glowing coals. What happened next would be recorded in Benton's journal as necessary restraint of a violent fugitive, though the truth was darker and more deliberate. Samuel fought with the strength of desperation, while Benton applied techniques learned through years of breaking resistance. The difference between subduing someone and destroying them was a line that professional slave catchers crossed routinely. The fire cast flickering shadows on a scene that played out across the antebellum South every night. Human beings reduced to property disputes, tracked through wilderness by men who'd made careers from others' suffering. The sound Samuel made when the chains first locked around his wrists was a noise Charles Benton would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. The rope around Samuel's neck led to Benton's saddle horn, a leash that kept the captured man stumbling forward through morning fog that hung between pine trees like ghosts of better possibilities. The journey back to Camden would take 2 days at forced march pace. This was when Charles Benton's true nature revealed itself, not in the hunt, but in the methodical cruelty that followed capture. Samuel's feet left bloody prints in sandy soil as they moved through backcountry paths that avoided main roads. Benton preferred these isolated routes for practical reasons. Fewer witnesses meant fewer questions about methods, fewer complications if runaways died from exhaustion during transport. The legal system rarely investigated the death of escaped slaves, treating such incidents as unfortunate but inevitable costs of recovering stolen property. The psychological torture began immediately. Benton would stop periodically to rest his horse while Samuel remained standing, chains preventing him from sitting or lying down. Water was rationed carefully, enough to prevent death, but insufficient for comfort. Food consisted of hardtack and jerky, fed by hand, like provisions for livestock. "Your family's probably worried sick," Benton would say during these stops, watching Samuel's face for emotional reactions. "Your wife Mary, wasn't it? And that boy of yours, little Thomas. They're wondering if you're dead or alive, if you're ever coming home." The details came from Morrison's correspondence, but Benton delivered them like intimate knowledge, psychological pressure designed to maximize suffering. He understood that physical pain was temporary, while emotional anguish could be sustained indefinitely. Professional slave catchers learned to inflict wounds that didn't show, damage that couldn't be documented in coroner's reports. Samuel tried silence at first, but isolation and exhaustion eventually broke down barriers that pride had constructed. He began talking to himself, then to Benton, fragments of prayers and memories spilling out like water from a cracked vessel. The bounty hunter listened with clinical interest, filing away information that might prove useful in future hunts. "God's gonna judge you for this," Samuel whispered during their second night, voice raw from thirst and desperation. "Maybe so," Benton replied, checking the chains for wear. "But I'll be judged as a man who honored his contracts and provided for his family. What's God gonna say about slaves who steal themselves from their rightful owners?" The theological justification came easily because Benton had heard similar arguments from pulpits across the Carolina Piedmont. Ministers who preached that slavery was divinely ordained, that runaways violated both human and heavenly law. These sermons provided comfortable frameworks for men whose livelihoods depended on human suffering, moral cover for activities that required none. From a letter to the Charleston Mercury, November 3, 1822. Professional slave catchers perform essential service to our Christian society by returning lost souls to proper supervision and godly instruction. Such men deserve our gratitude, not condemnation. The landscape around them showed autumn's approach in changing leaves and cooler nights. Cotton fields stretched toward horizons where other enslaved people bent over plants that would generate wealth they'd never taste. Samuel stared at these workers with expressions that mixed longing and warning, knowing his capture would be witnessed, discussed, remembered. Benton noticed everything. The way field hands looked away when they passed. The careful neutrality of white overseers who recognized his profession but asked no questions. The system that supported his work through active participation and deliberate ignorance. Every successful hunt strengthened the infrastructure of fear that kept 4 million people in bondage. They stopped at a plantation house where Benton knew the owner, sharing whiskey while Samuel remained chained to a fence post like a horse. The conversation focused on recent escapes, upcoming auctions, the eternal problem of managing human property that possessed inconvenient desires for freedom. Such discussions happened across the South every day, casual conversations about trafficking in human souls. "That one's given you trouble," the plantation owner observed, nodding toward Samuel. "They all give trouble eventually," Benton replied. "That's why they pay me to clean up the mess." The economics of slave catching created perverse incentives. Bounty hunters received payment only upon delivery, encouraging methods that prioritized compliance over humanity. Dead runaways brought reduced fees, but eliminated future escape attempts. The mathematics of human misery, calculated in dollars and fear. Night sounds filled the darkness around their camp as they neared Camden. Owls calling across fields where other desperate people might be planning their own escapes, their own doomed attempts at freedom. The cycle would continue because the system demanded it, because men like Charles Benton made comfortable livings from others' dreams of liberation. Samuel had stopped talking, his spirit apparently broken by 2 days of methodical degradation. But Benton knew better than to trust appearances when dealing with desperate people. The plantation where Samuel's nightmare would end was now less than 12 hours away, and something in the young man's eyes suggested his surrender might be another carefully constructed deception. The Morrison plantation spread across 3,000 acres of prime cotton land, where 200 enslaved people worked under the supervision of overseers who understood that productivity depended on the systematic application of terror. Samuel's return would serve as public education for anyone contemplating similar rebellion. This was where Charles Benton delivered his human cargo and collected his fee. But what happened next would stain even his hardened conscience. The plantation bell rang at sunrise on October 15, 1822, summoning every enslaved person to witness Samuel's punishment. They gathered in the yard between the main house and quarters, faces carefully composed into masks that revealed nothing while seeing everything. Morrison believed in public discipline, understanding that fear spread more effectively than disease when properly cultivated. Benton watched from the main house porch, counting his $50 fee while Morrison examined his returned property for damage. The plantation owner was a meticulous man who treated slaves like expensive machinery, concerned more with maintaining function than showing mercy. Samuel's 2-day absence had cost him perhaps $6 in lost labor, but the example of punishment was worth far more in deterrent value. "Strip him and tie him to the post," Morrison commanded his overseer, a scarred man named Hutchins, who'd built his reputation on creative approaches to breaking human resistance. 50 lashes for theft of his own person. Let everyone see what running costs. The whipping post stood in the plantation's center like a monument to controlled brutality, its base stained dark with blood from previous lessons. Samuel was bound, with his arms stretched overhead, his back exposed to leather strips embedded with metal fragments designed to maximize damage while minimizing the risk of fatal injury. Benton had witnessed hundreds of such punishments, but something in Samuel's demeanor suggested this spectacle would be different. The young man's eyes held a clarity that spoke of decisions made during the long march home, of prices calculated and accepted. From Morrison's Plantation Journal, October 15, 1822. Administered correction to the runaway Samuel. Example made before full assembly. Expect improved discipline throughout the property. The first lash opened skin across Samuel's shoulders, like a zipper revealing flesh beneath. He made no sound, staring directly at his wife Mary and son Thomas in the assembled crowd. The second stroke drew blood that ran down his back in crimson streams, but still he remained silent. By the 10th lash, other slaves had begun shifting uncomfortably, recognizing something beyond normal resignation in Samuel's response to torture. Hutchins paused, studying his victim with professional concern. Most slaves broke audibly within 20 lashes, crying out or begging for mercy that would never come. Samuel's silence suggested either extraordinary courage or complete psychological break, both of which could complicate the punishment's intended educational value. "Want to tell everyone what you learned about running?" Morrison called from his porch position. Samuel raised his head, blood running from cuts on his scalp where the whip had wrapped around his skull. His voice carried clearly across the yard, reaching every enslaved person forced to witness his destruction. "I learned that freedom's worth dying for," he said, each word distinct despite his injuries. "I learned that some chains only break when you're willing to break with them." The words hung in morning air like smoke from a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. Morrison's face darkened with recognition that this punishment was failing to achieve its psychological objectives. Instead of demonstrating the futility of resistance, Samuel was transforming his torture into testimony, his suffering into inspiration. "Continue the punishment," Morrison ordered, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. The remaining 40 lashes fell on a man who had already transcended physical pain, who used each stroke to drive home lessons about dignity that no amount of suffering could erase. Other enslaved people absorbed these lessons, reading meanings in Samuel's silence that their owners couldn't comprehend. Benton found himself disturbed by the spectacle in ways he hadn't anticipated. Professional slave catchers were paid to return property, not to participate in executions disguised as discipline. Yet Morrison's punishment was crossing lines that even hardened bounty hunters recognized as excessive. When the 50th lash fell, Samuel hung unconscious in his bonds, blood pooling beneath the whipping post like spilled paint. Hutchins checked his pulse with the casual efficiency of someone accustomed to calibrating punishment between educational value and property damage. "He'll live," the overseer announced, "though he won't be working for weeks." Morrison nodded satisfaction, believing justice had been served according to both legal precedent and divine mandate. The assembled slaves were dismissed to their labors, carrying with them images and implications that would ferment in whispered conversations for months. But Samuel had planted seeds that would bloom in ways none of them anticipated. The young man would indeed survive his punishment, though he would never be the same. Neither would Charles Benton, who found himself questioning methods that had never troubled his conscience before. 3 weeks after Samuel's punishment, a letter arrived at the Camden post office addressed to the American Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia, written in careful script by someone who'd obviously learned letters in secret. The letter described specific details of torture that only an eyewitness could have recorded. This correspondence would transform a routine slave-catching operation into a national scandal that exposed the machinery of bondage to northern audiences who preferred their brutality at a comfortable distance. The letter was signed "A Friend of Justice," but Charles Benton knew exactly who had written it. During Samuel's punishment, he'd noticed a young woman in the assembled crowd, perhaps 16 years old, whose eyes moved systematically across the scene as if memorizing details for later transcription. Her face had remained carefully neutral, but her attention was too focused, too deliberate for casual observation. Hannah Morrison, the plantation owner's niece, had been visiting from Charleston when Samuel was returned. Educated at a young ladies' academy where she'd been exposed to abolitionist literature, despite her family's best efforts to shield her from such influences. Her presence at the punishment had been mandatory, part of her education in managing human property that would someday inherit. But Hannah possessed a conscience that plantation society hadn't successfully corrupted, and Samuel's dignity under torture had awakened moral questions that comfortable distance had previously suppressed. She wrote letters describing not just the whipping, but the entire system that supported it. The casual conversations about human trafficking, the economic calculations that reduced people to livestock. From Hannah Morrison's correspondence, I watched a man transform his suffering into testimony, watched him choose dignity over survival. I cannot remain silent about what I witnessed, cannot participate in a system that destroys souls for profit. Her letters reached Philadelphia newspapers that reprinted excerpts across the North, creating public pressure for congressional investigation into slave-catching practices. The details she provided were specific enough to verify, including dates, locations, and witness names that confirmed her credibility. Hannah had created documentation that abolitionists could use as ammunition in their war against bondage, Benton learned about the letters when Morrison summoned him to the plantation in November, his usual composure shattered by developments he couldn't control. The plantation owner paced his study like a caged animal, waving newspaper clippings that contained detailed descriptions of his property management techniques. "Someone's been talking," Morrison said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Someone who knows too much about our business arrangements." The bounty hunter studied the newspaper excerpts with growing concern. Professional slave catchers depended on public tolerance, if not outright support, for their activities. Negative publicity could complicate future operations, make clients reluctant to hire controversial contractors, even inspire legislative restrictions on their methods. "Could be anyone," Benton replied, though he suspected Hannah's involvement. Slaves talk among themselves, create stories that sound more dramatic in retelling. But both men knew these accounts were too accurate, too detailed for secondhand information. Someone with direct access to plantation records and personal conversations had provided northern newspapers with ammunition that could damage the entire slave-catching industry. Hannah's letters continued arriving in Philadelphia throughout the winter, each one documenting additional examples of systematic cruelty that contradicted Southern claims about benevolent paternalism. She wrote about families separated at auction, children sold away from parents, the calculated use of sexual violence as control mechanism. Her insider perspective provided credibility that escaped slaves' testimonies sometimes lacked. The impact extended beyond individual reputations. Congressional representatives began citing Hannah's letters during debates about slavery's expansion into Western territories. Northern churches used her descriptions to illustrate moral arguments against bondage. The Underground Railroad incorporated her documentation into appeals for increased support from sympathetic communities. Benton found his services suddenly in less demand, as plantation owners worried about public scrutiny that accompanied his operations. Some clients requested more discretionary methods. Others sought alternative approaches to runaway recovery that attracted less attention. The comfortable anonymity that had protected his profession was dissolving under northern spotlight. Samuel had recovered from his physical injuries, but carried psychological scars that manifested in unexpected ways. He worked with mechanical efficiency while maintaining careful distance from other enslaved people, as if protecting them from contamination by his dangerous example. The punishment had achieved Morrison's immediate objectives while creating longer-term problems that wouldn't become apparent for months. The letters revealed something else. Hannah Morrison was planning to leave South Carolina, to abandon her inheritance, and join abolitionist organizations in Philadelphia. Her defection represented more than individual conscience, but evidence that slavery's contradictions were beginning to tear apart even families that profited from bondage. The system that had seemed so permanent, so naturally ordained, was developing cracks that would eventually split it apart from within. But Charles Benton's darkest chapter was still ahead, waiting in the swamps of the Santee River, where his next hunt would push him beyond the boundaries that had previously constrained his cruelty. The reward poster nailed to the courthouse door offered $200 for Martha Williams, an enslaved woman who disappeared from the Rutledge plantation with her 3 children and a stolen horse. The amount suggested desperation on the owner's part, or perhaps something more personal than economics. This hunt would teach Charles Benton that some prey fights back in ways that transform predator into victim, that some escapes are worth more than money or reputation. Martha had vanished during the second week of December, 1822, taking advantage of winter weather that limited tracking conditions and shortened daylight hours available for pursuit. She'd planned methodically, stockpiling supplies over months and studying routes through interviews with other enslaved people who'd attempted escape. This was calculator behavior, the most dangerous category in Benton's taxonomy. The stolen horse suggested either desperate improvisation or calculated intelligence gathering. Martha worked as seamstress in the Rutledge house, position that provided access to family conversations, correspondence, visitor discussions about travel routes, and friendly contacts. House slaves often possessed information networks that field hands never developed. Knowledge that could transform amateur escape attempts into sophisticated operations. Benton accepted the contract despite growing unease about public scrutiny surrounding his profession. Hannah Morrison's letters had created political complications that made some clients reluctant to hire controversial contractors. But $200 represented 4 months' income from ordinary pursuits, enough to justify risks that careful planning could minimize. The trail led southwest toward the Santee River swamps, terrain that favored fugitives over pursuers. Cypress trees and standing water limited horse travel, while providing numerous hiding spots for people who understood the landscape. Martha had chosen her route wisely, forcing Benton to proceed on foot through territory where his advantages diminished significantly. From Benton's journal, December 20th, 1822. The Williams woman shows advanced planning, possibly assistance from outside sources. Children ages 4, 7, and 9 will slow progress but increase emotional stakes. Expect encounter within 48 hours. He found their first camp on the 3rd day, signs indicating they'd rested for several hours before moving deeper into swamp territory. Martha had chosen defensible positions and covered her tracks with sophisticated techniques that suggested military-style instruction. Someone had taught her surveillance detection, route planning, even basic fieldcraft that exceeded normal slave experience. The children's footprints told stories of exhaustion and fear, but also determination. 9-year-old Sarah, 7-year-old James, 4-year-old little Martha. Their mother was carrying the youngest periodically, while encouraging the older children through terrain that challenged experienced hunters. The psychology of maternal desperation created unpredictable variables that complicated Benton's usual methods. Trail sign indicated they'd been eating well despite traveling light. Martha was foraging successfully, finding food sources that sustained her family through harsh winter conditions. This knowledge suggested training beyond household skills, possibly instruction from someone with wilderness experience who prepared her for extended survival. The confrontation came at dawn on December 22nd, in a clearing where Martha had established what appeared to be permanent camp rather than temporary rest stop. She'd built shelter, organized supplies, created defensive positions that suggested she intended to fight rather than flee further. 3 children slept beneath lean-to construction, while their mother stood watch with stolen pistol in capable hands. Mrs. Williams, Benton called from tree line, his voice carrying careful respect that acknowledged the weapon she carried. "Your master Rutledge sent me to bring you and the children home safe." Martha's response came without hesitation, her words clear despite trembling hands. "My children are already home, Mr. Benton. Home is where we're free." The negotiation that followed revealed intelligence networks and planning, sophistication that shocked even experienced slave catchers. Martha possessed detailed knowledge about underground railroad operations, safe houses, sympathetic contacts extending north into Virginia and beyond. Someone had provided her with resources that transformed escape attempt into strategic relocation. But winter weather and children's needs had slowed progress enough for professional pursuit to close distance. Martha faced choices that no parent should confront: surrender and return to bondage, or resist with violence that might orphan her children regardless of outcome. The sound of safety hammers being drawn echoed across the clearing like breaking bones. What happened next would haunt Charles Benton for the rest of his life, would transform him from confident predator into something else entirely. Martha Williams had prepared for this moment with a thoroughness that characterized everything about her escape, and her preparations included contingencies that slave catchers never anticipated. The first shot came from Martha's pistol, deliberate and well-aimed, striking the tree 6 inches from Benton's head, with accuracy that spoke of serious training rather than desperate flailing. The second shot followed immediately, forcing him to cover while she repositioned with tactical awareness that no plantation seamstress should possess. This was the moment when Charles Benton realized he'd underestimated his quarry in ways that would cost him everything he thought he understood about power, control, and the inevitability of capture. Martha moved through the swamp like someone who'd studied the terrain for months rather than days, using cypress roots and standing water to mask her approach while keeping her children positioned behind natural barriers. Her eldest daughter, Sarah, had been trained to reload weapons. Her son, James, served as lookout. Even 4-year-old little Martha knew to remain silent despite chaos erupting around their shelter. Benton had walked into a prepared ambush orchestrated by someone with military-style instruction and resources he couldn't immediately identify. The stolen horse had been bait, drawing him deeper into terrain where his advantages disappeared while Martha's multiplied exponentially. She'd studied his methods, anticipated his psychology, prepared counters to tactics he'd used successfully for years. "You made one mistake, Mr. Benton," Martha called from concealed position. "You assumed we were running from something instead of running to something better." The revelation struck him like physical blow. Martha wasn't fleeing randomly, but executing planned relocation to predetermined destination where support networks waited to receive her family. The Underground Railroad had evolved beyond simple escape assistance into sophisticated operations that included military training, strategic planning, even counterintelligence, designed to neutralize threats like professional slave catchers. Another shot sparked off Cypress Spark, followed by voice he didn't recognize. Male, authority-laden, speaking from different position entirely. Martha had backup, armed support that transformed individual escape into organized resistance against the entire system of human recovery. "Charles Benton," the unseen voice commanded, "you're surrounded by people who've had enough of your particular profession. Drop your weapons and walk away. Or discover what justice looks like when victims fight back." The mathematics of the situation had reversed completely. Instead of one bounty hunter pursuing desperate fugitives, Benton faced coordinated resistance from multiple trained opponents who'd chosen this terrain specifically to neutralize his advantages. The hunter had become prey in ways that challenged everything he'd believed about power dynamics and racial hierarchies. From a letter intercepted by federal authorities, January 3, 1823, the Benton incident demonstrates that resistance networks have evolved beyond simple escape assistance. Armed confrontation suggests coordinated military-style operations that pose direct threat to institution of slave recovery. Fighting erupted across the swamp clearing as Benton attempted to withdraw, while Martha's supporters maintained tactical pressure designed to disable rather than kill. They wanted him alive, capable of carrying messages back to other bounty hunters about changing rules of engagement. The psychological impact of failed operations often proved more effective than body counts in deterring future activities. Benton escaped the ambush with wounds that would heal, but psychological damage that would permanently alter his approach to slave catching. He'd encountered organized resistance that possessed resources, training, and strategic thinking that transformed individual desperation into collective action. The implications extended far beyond single failed hunt. Martha Williams and her children disappeared into Underground Railroad networks that delivered them safely to Canada, where they established new lives beyond the reach of American law. Their successful escape inspired others, while demonstrating that systematic resistance could defeat even professional slave catchers when properly organized and adequately supported. The incident marked a turning point in Benton's career and reputation. Word spread through bounty hunter networks about the failed capture, about coordinated resistance that had outmaneuvered experienced professionals. Some clients began seeking alternative approaches to runaway recovery that avoided confrontations with increasingly sophisticated opposition. Benton continued slave catching for several more years, but with diminished enthusiasm and increasing caution about the risks involved. The comfortable certainties that had sustained his profession were dissolving under pressure from resistance networks that refused to accept the inevitability of capture and return to bondage. The swamps where Martha Williams had prepared her ambush became legendary among enslaved communities, a place where the natural order had been reversed, where victims had become victors through courage and careful planning. Even today, locals claim that winter nights in the Santee River swamps carry sounds of celebration, voices singing freedom songs that echo through cypress trees like prayers finally answered. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.